Prime Minister Narendra Modi met US President Joe Biden and attended the Quad Leaders Summit in the Wilmington, Delaware on Saturday as part of his three-day visit to the United States, underlining that the Quad leaders are meeting at a time when the world is surrounded by conflicts and tension. Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that the grouping was not against anybody. This is seen as aimed at China's aggressive behavior in the Indo-Pacific. With an eye on China, the joint statement said, "As leaders, we are steadfast in our conviction that international law, including respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity and the maintenance of peace, safety, security and stability in the maritime domain, underpin the sustainability, development and prosperity on the Indo-Pacific. We emphasize the importance of adherence to international law, particularly as reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, to address challenges to the global maritime rules-based order, including with respect to maritime claims. We are seriously concerned about the situation in the East and South China Seas." In an answer to the reporter's question on the future of the Quad after November 5th US election, Biden said that it would go way beyond November before the four leaders erupted in laughter. Biden patted the shoulder of Prime Minister Modi while giving the answer to the media about who will be in fact taking the Quad forward. India will be hosting the next Quad summit in 2025. Meanwhile, while addressing the two-day United Nations Summit of the Future Conference, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said that peace was contingent on the reform of global institutions. The Prime Minister also called for reforms in the global institutions, pointing to the African Union's new G20 membership as an example of progress. For global peace and development, reforms in global institutions are necessary. Reform is the path to reverence, he said. How successful is the Quad grouping to contain China? And will there ever be a consensus on the UN reforms? These are the two questions that we are in fact asking here on the News9 Plus show. And joining me to discuss this further, our Ambassador Meera Shankar, former Indian Ambassador to USA. We also have Dr. Sriparna Pathak, Associate Professor of International Politics, OP Jindal Global University. And finally, Dr. Swasti Rao, Associate Fellow, MPIDSA. Thank you very much. You know, I must admit, I'm really happy that I have an all-woman panel here, because the next debate that I'm doing is on women. But Dr. Ambassador Shankar, if I can come to you first, you know, how do you see the recent meetings that have taken place, in the United States, especially the Quad, not happening in Delhi, but in fact in Delaware? Is this merely aimed at domestic political concerns that Biden may have in the run-up to the elections? Or do you see a larger picture of a specific theme vis-a-vis China, as we, of course, are looking towards hosting Quad next year?
No, I think that for President Biden, this would have been his last Quad meeting since he will hand over the baton in January next year.
That's right.
So I think it was an important occasion, because he signaled the importance that he attaches to the Quad as a grouping which plays an important role in the Indo-Pacific. The Quad lists as its objective, promoting and preserving a free, open, and inclusive and prosperous Indo-Pacific. And in this process, it has tried to define its role, because it's not specifically a military alliance, but does deal with issues of non-conventional security, such as climate change or maritime security, response to natural disasters, ensuring the reliability of supply and diversified supply chains, particularly in the areas of critical technology, and looking at global health issues, including pandemics. So there is a range of issues on which the Quad is cooperating. In this meeting, I think some important decisions were taken, particularly with regard to maritime security, where the Maritime Domain Awareness Program of the Quad which shares information on illegal activities in the Indo-Pacific, will be extended to the Indian Ocean with India's participation uh, to facilitate the absorption of the information and data provided. There will also be training programs
Right.
and capacity building programs for other countries in the region to actually make the maximum benefit of this maritime domain awareness program. Then you have the decision for a ship observer mission of the Coast Guards, and probably this could lead to some kind of joint patrolling in the region. Finally, you would have, you know, a logistics network, a pilot project for joint airlift by the four countries to respond more quickly to natural disasters or unforeseen cataclysmic events.
Right.
So that's an important element of the decisions which have been taken. There's also a decision to look what they call to work for eradicating cancer in the region,
Absolutely.
and a program called the Moonshot Cancer Program, which will initially look at cervical cancer, with India providing $7.5 billion worth of screening and vaccinations,
Fair
screening
enough.
equipment, vaccination. So overall, some important decisions taken at the Quad, and an occasion to take stock of where the Quad has come, how far it has come, and to provide directions for the future. Now, if you take a look, if it's Kamala Harris, she will continue Biden's program as far as the Quad is concerned. And President Trump, if you go back, he was one, it was during his term that the Quad was reactivated and a ministerial meeting of the Quad was held. So I presume he would take ownership and perhaps continue the importance that is attached to the Quad. I think what is helping is the fact that initially when Quad started, it was tentative, primarily because the country's main actors had not yet made up their minds whether they saw China as an opportunity.
Let me get in Sriparna at this moment. Sriparna, do you think that the recent meeting that took place and the declaration that really came out, more than 5,000 words really, without mentioning China and Russia, really demonstrates a new era? And how does it do so?
It definitely demonstrates a new era. Even though China wasn't mentioned by name, there was a clear-cut China focus because it talked about free and inclusive Indo-Pacific region where China's aggression is heightened and has been increasing. So even without naming China, when one talks about a free and inclusive Indo-Pacific, it's very clear as to, because there's just one country which is increasing its aggression in the Indo-Pacific region. Is this of any merit? Many years ago when the Quad was coming up, China had called it like froth on the ocean, which is going to dissipate with time. But then over the next few years, China went on to call it the Asian NATO. So even China understands that even without saying it or even without naming it, there is a heightened need for like-minded countries to come together because China is proving to be a very difficult challenge. Um, you know, some highlights of this Quad meeting go beyond just what has been talked about. One thing is that there are these rumblings that Mumbai is going to host a Quad regional ports and transportation conference in the same year. Why and how? Because if we are talking about establishing alternative supply routes, it is very pertinent that we start talking about ports. If heavens forbid there is a full-blown Taiwan Straits crisis, there is a need to trade through ports which would be outside the affected area. If you look at two countries of the Quad, India and Australia, and if you try to understand how much trade happens through ports, you will see it's very, very minimal. that amount of trade, Australia has greater port connectivity with China than it has with India. So it becomes important that there's a Quad Regional Ports and Transportation Conference. These are all sorts of preparations. So, which is why I think that this was very good. Which is why there was, so many words which were used, 5,000 words, and that's why the declaration was so long. It's all a preparation for China becoming even more aggressive than it already is. So on that note, I think this was a successful Quad meeting, and there should be more such discussions and deliberations.
Well, there's much more expected on the Quad front, especially in India when it hosts this next year. But getting in Swasti at this point in time on the debate, Dr. Rao, what do you think about the missing element, the missing military element in the Quad at a time when we are facing two simultaneous wars? You've seen, of course, you yourself perhaps were in Poland and Ukraine very recently. And I have seen, of course, the negotiations that have been underway on Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah front. But
Yeah.
how specifically important and strategic is India hosting Quad, and what would be the top areas of concern for India in the next 1 year?
Right. Good afternoon to you, Aditya. And with respect to the missing military component in Quad, I think the first question first, and it requires a bit of clarification as well, which is that Quad was never really meant to be a military alliance. It is not a military alliance. And also about India's Weltanschauung, which is what is India's foreign policy worldview out there. India has never really believed in alliances. India is not an alliance with any country. India has partnerships and multifaceted partnerships, but not an alliance. So what really Quad stands for, and from an Indian perspective, is a collaborative framework for a free, open, and also, let's not forget, inclusive Indo-Pacific. So right now, of course, everybody understands that it is really China which is the elephant in the room, but China agnosticism will continue because we do not want to play into the hands of China by actually calling or adding the military component to it. We don't really believe in Quad being an Asian NATO from any stretch of the measure. That's one. And the other thing about being more realistic about what Quad can then do, I think a couple of things. I think from India's perspective, there is no, I think there is a resilience in India's perspective and also in India's mature approach to understand that, yes, we live in a very complex world. The world is seeing more militarization. You mentioned the case of Ukraine. India's footprint in the war effort, I mean, in the sense that in the mediation effort to bring the war to an end has been growing. You saw that Prime Minister Modi has just met Zelensky 3 times now in 3 months. That itself shows that India's credibility as a player that can finally mediate whenever the time is right for mediation. I remember last time speaking to you and saying that right now the time is not right for mediation, but whenever the time is right for mediation, I think India has been very, very consistent about its commitment to the fact that this is not an era for war, and that today's world's problems cannot really be tackled till the time we really bring this bloodshed and this mayhem and murder to a stop. And so that's one credibility quotient with India. The other thing is about also India's bilateral interests, etc. So what I'm trying to say is that India is aware of the fact that there is bloodshed, there is militarization in the world, and India itself, I mean, if you look at how our own defense ecosystem is progressing, the kind of work that the Ministry of Defense has done in that regard, I think it's pretty commendable. So I personally think that there is this wonderful combination that India is right now pursuing, which is that India wants to be diversified in its defense equipment, wants to also be self-reliant in its defense equipment, and of course, it's a bigger debate out there. But again, at the same time, this is not coming at the cost of what kind of a worldview does India have. And if you remember the Prime Minister's remarks, he actually gave a blueprint for that India's Viksit Bharat, worldview, and he said beautifully that he gave this metaphor of a push, which basically in English means flower. And he said that this is a blueprint for a Viksit Bharat. And he said that actually, if you break this down, it stands for a progressive, unstoppable, skilled and spiritual, humanity first and prosperous Bharat, right? So I think this is a kind of a leadership that we require. Coming back to your very important part of your question about Quad and its missing military component, I think there is one thing that we are missing in this particular debate, which is the development made on the IPMDA. I think one of the things that needs to be discussed a little bit more is that whenever we are speaking about a maritime domain or anything that is imagined as this key construct, in the maritime domain, like for example, the IPMDA. Please remember that all kinds of security challenges today, whether it's piracy, whether it's, safety of the critical infrastructure like subsea cables, communication cables, etc., all of that actually fall into the purview of hybrid threats. And for tackling those hybrid threats, what you really need is a kind of a real-time linking of your information portals between the different kinds of, domain awareness information collection initiatives, right? So right now, India has its own, Japan has its own, USA has their own. But when you think of something collaborative like the IPMDA, then you think of more frameworks to actually cooperate on maritime technology, etc. All of these initiatives are basically aiming at making the seas more secure, which essentially connects to our original question of how do you actually secure the sea lanes of communication, and part of
Right.
which was Shwanda was speaking about. So I think it would be a tad bit, incomplete to say that just because Quad has a missing overtly military component from its worldview or from its vision, it does not really qualify as a security architecture. I think what we really need to keep in mind is that the kind of security challenges and threats that really mired the Indo-Pacific architecture or meet Indo-Pacific theater, I think Quad is more suited to handle them, okay, as
Right.
long as it is really getting its act together on the IPMDA and its other successive, programs. Back to
Fair
you.
enough. I want to now move towards the second push that Prime Minister Modi actually gave in that summit of the future, and he spoke about the UN reforms. Has it really been a habitual kind of a vicious circle where Ambassador Shankar, we go to the UN, we call for reforms, but nothing really practically happens? Of course, India has said that the summit document, for the first time containing a detailed paragraph on Security Council reform, is a good beginning. But is this enough? Why do you think that there is continuing hegemony of a few at the United Nations, or perhaps is that the reason that there are no reforms? For instance, terrorism. You cannot define. I mean, for the last 25 years, you have been sitting on a definition on terrorism and not moving forward. So what will eventually bring UN reforms, if at all?
Well, at the moment, I think everyone recognizes the need for UN reform.
Right.
Because the world is beset with multiple crises, including the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, the challenge, and then challenges which will require cooperation by all countries because they are transboundary in nature, be it climate change, be it global pandemics, be it dealing with terrorism or piracy or the threat of nuclear proliferation. There are a range of challenges which the world confronts. And the UN, as it is currently structured, has clearly proved unable to actually address these challenges effectively. It has been inadequate. So if you look at the UN, it really reflects the world order as it emerged after the Second World War. So you have three countries, two countries from Europe, and if you include Russia as a European country, then three countries from Europe and the US, and then one country, China, from Asia. This clearly doesn't represent either the economic realities of today, where economic growth has got dispersed around the world and new centers of economic growth have emerged. It doesn't reflect the populations which are dispersed around the world. When you see, a country like India, which is now probably the most populous country in the world, is not in the UN. And so you look at the need for restructuring the UN, its procedures, the Security Council, its composition, to better reflect the realities of today. There, I think there is consensus. Where there is no consensus is how do we go about it. And initially, I think India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan had put themselves forward as potential, additional members of a reformed Security Council in the category. The problem is that there are countries in the neighborhood who oppose, for instance, Argentina opposes Brazil.
Yeah.
China opposes Japan. China opposes India. And as far as India is concerned, individually, 4 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council have supported India's candidature, whether it's Russia, whether it's UK, whether it's France, whether it's the US. The one country that has not done so is China. So for India to keep this subject on the agenda, I think is important.
Right.
And if change does not happen today, it will eventually happen. Of that, I am optimistic.
That's a very important point about India setting the narrative really about the UN reforms taking place. Will those text-based negotiations really happen, Dr. Pathak? I want to come to you at this point because, over the last 2 years, we're facing these wars continuously. What has the United Nations really done apart from lip service? They should have had a predominant role in peacekeeping, in maintaining, in fact, diplomacy, dialogue that could eventually lead to a conclusion, a peaceful conclusion. But what we see is perhaps UN being a mute spectator, unable to have a mechanism for some kind of a reform. So how do you see this development and the failure of the United Nations?
See, the UN has failed at multiple levels. It's not just because it has not included very important members of the international community into the Security Council. It's also because, as you said, it constantly engages in lip service. The massacre which happened in Rwanda is a bit old, but again, recently also, UNRWA officials or workers were taking part in the October 7th massacre, terrorism in Israel. So this reduces the credibility of such organizations. Second, it's really not been able to do much to prevent conflicts per se. Also, it picks and chooses conflicts. So there is a need for reform at multiple levels. Unless that happens, and the starting, of course, has to be by the inclusion of important members, which have been performing economically well, which have leadership roles of the hitherto unlistened to community of the global south. Unless they get included, the other things, I don't even know how to enlist them. Then there's a shortage of funding for a lot of UN programs. So UN has been faltering at multiple levels. The UN Charter, how many times has it been reformed since it was really formed? So starting from those small things to the bigger things like UNSC reform, the UN, unfortunately, at this moment, is pretty defunct. Unless it gets reformed, I don't see it being a very effective international organization to combat newer and emerging challenges.
Well, there are much more reforms that are required. In fact, a beginning certainly hasn't been made. Of course, India has made that statement, but a lot more is certainly expected from the United Nations. I'm sorry, I'm out of time right now, but Dr. Swasti, we'll bring you again on the debate and debate this further. Thank you very much, Ambassador Meera Shankar, Dr. Swasti Rao, and of course, Dr. Sriparna for joining us on the debate.